Hi there. Today we're going to have a code-along start-to-end example of a crawling automation. You may ask, what's a crawling automation? Well, let's have a real-life example. Let's say we want to search on imdb.com for movies that contain a certain plot. Let's say horses, for example. After we hit the search button, IMDb displays us the first 50 titles that contain horses in their plot. What we want to do with our script is to navigate here and snatch all this information. We will output all this information with keys like title, rating, and description. Without further introduction, let's start our automation journey. First, let's create some inputs for our automation. Let's create the URL input. Here, just paste the link to imdb.com search. Now let's add another input. Let's say the plot input. This will be helpful if later we want to search for movies with another plot. Let's say today we will search for movies with the robots plot. Now, switch back to the script tab and let's create our first action, the navigate action. Let's label it and let's use the get input pipe. Select the URL input. Now, let's refresh our autopilot and test our newly created action. Now that we are on the search page, let's create a new context for that. Let's rename it IMDb landing page and let's create a matcher for it. I suggest we create a matcher on this search box. So let's use a query one pipe and let's use the interactive mode to select this element. What Autopilot tells us is that there are multiple elements found with this selector. Well, let's switch to the query all pipe and see which elements have the same CSS selector. It looks like it's those two. Well, let's use the inspect tool and see if there's something different about them. I see this one is part of a form element and this one as well. And if you can see, this action attribute is different between them. So let's structure our CSS selector. Let's use the form element with this action attribute. And let's use a list exists pipe. This will throw a boolean true value if this object exists on the web page. Now let's label our matcher and let's test it. Now let's create an input action to fill in this search box. We can use the same CSS selector as we did earlier for the matcher, just add at the end an input element. Now use again the get input pipe and select the plot input. Let's label our action and let's test it. Now we will need a click action for the search button. If I'm not wrong, it's contained in the same form element. Yes, it is. So we can use again the same CSS selector, but in the end add a button element. Let's label our action and let's test it. Now IMDb takes us to a page where they list the first 50 titles. Well, let's start building our output. First, let's create a new context. Let's rename it. Let's create a matcher for it. I suggest we create a matcher on the list that contains all those movies. And it should be this one. Use the query one pipe, this CSS selector, and the list exists pipe. Let's label our matcher and let's test it. Now, let's create our output action. This will serve as our crawling result. Let's name it. And let's use the query all pipe to select all the elements that contain details about those movies. Let's use this CSS selector. Now, because I took a look before recording this video, I know that some videos from this 50 elements list don't contain a rating. So let's filter them out. We will use the list filter pipe, and inside it we want to create a condition that states if this element is contained in this element, we keep it. If not, it's thrown away. So let's build our condition. First, use the query one pipe with this CSS selector and use the optional setting. Now use again the list exists pipe. Now we see from 50 elements we only have 43. Those 43 have a rating. So let's start enriching our output. First, use the setPath pipe to set the title path. Let's see what element we can use to extract its information and use it as our title. Okay, let's use query one pipe with this selector. And after it, use an A element. Let's switch to query all pipe and let's use the limit 1 pipe. This will limit all your results to the first one. Let's use the get text pipe to see what we obtained. For now, it looks good. Now, let's set the rating path. We're going to use this element and as we see here, it has an attribute called data value that corresponds to its rating. So let's use the get attribute pipe and select the data value attribute. Good. Now let's set the description path. Let's see which element we can use for that. It looks like there's no specific element containing this description. Well, we can use a pipe called getChildrenText to extract this information. First, let's select this element, use this CSS selector, and use the getChildText pipe. What it does, it returns text content of direct text node children of an element, ignoring nested elements, like those ones. For now, it looks good. And because the output must result to a single item, let's use the list2array pipe to fold all our elements to an array. Let's test our output. If we check the results tab, we will see how our output looks like. Well, let's reload the whole thing, close this tab, and let's play it again. what we forgot to do is to specify that this context is a success context. That means after the last action is played, Autopilot will consider the execution successfully. We could do this or either create a success action. But for now, we are going to use the flow to success. So let's play our script again and see if this time it works. Good, so the execution was successfully. Now, let's change our plot input to cats. And let's reload the whole thing. We have a list of movies that contain cats in their plot, and we have our crawling result here. There are 45 of them that have a rating. Good. So that was all for today. Thank you for your attention.